Okay, thank you for these very stimulating presentations. Now, I'm very thankful for the efforts of the speakers to provide me with some of what was going to be said this morning. However, I have been discovering these presentations with you. So, and we do not have much time. We basically have 20 minutes. So I will limit my intervention, my questions to a couple of issues, and then to let your lot here, so to let you ask the question you need to ask in 20 minutes. What I wanted to these three papers or these three presentations deal each with the law in a particular present the law under a particular light. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt like the first presentation was asking the question: what if law even what effect has the law, like City Statutes of 2001, on the practices? On does it have a positive, negative effect? Is the law, as you said, guilty of malpractices or non-implementation? The second presentation was talking about the law in a more, I felt, negative way. You used the term violence many times to explain the violence of the law, the violence of resettlement on people's lives, and the third presentation was talking, I felt, in a more positive light about law's intervention or legal intervention on informality, at least, since we see that despite very abundant literature about the virtues of mobility, in the people and citizens' view, law can have some positive effects on their lives. So basically, we have three different positions about law, and that will be my question. What bothers me in this definition, in this presentation of law, is we see law as a monolithic intervention into people's life. Will it be bad or good, or we don't know? So I was asking, how do you, what in your different fieldworks, how do other mobilizations of law take place, especially through courts? I mean, independently from laws, from legal texts, implementation in Mexico or India or Brazil, how do we see subversive use of other interpretations of law, of property laws, in a way to impose another legal order from below? We have been starting to see this in Lebanon, for example, in the Palestinian case, as many people talked about it here, so I won't be long about it, but we know that the 2021 law forbids Palestinian refugees to own land in Lebanon totally. Since a year or so, we have been witnessing we have seen some lawyers and some people trying to use courts through strategic litigation to promote a different legal interpretations about property, what is proper property transmission, to try to unlock this order imposed by the Lebanese state for reasons I won't talk about here. So how can you present a more nuanced image of law in your different fieldworks? And then I'll give the talk to the present.
Well, thank you. That's the most interesting question. What I can say is, regarding the case of Brazil, one of the points I made was that part of the criticism a number of people have of this law, the city statute, results from their own view of what the law is. I mean, I said that I myself view the law as a political process, a social-political, open-ended social-political process, a social-political arena where you manifest competing claims and where competing claims dispute with each other. But the dominant view of law is not that. It's law as being merely an instrument, a tool, which is neutral, which is ahistorical, which is objective. And this is very much the kind of legal teaching that you find in the law schools all over the world, right? So if you view the law as the result of, as well as the arena of a social political process, then you come up with a completely different understanding, right? I mean, the city statute itself didn't come out of, nothing. It was very much the result of decades of popular struggles in Brazil. You were talking about a building from below, and this is very much what happened there. When the law was approved back in 2001, we had about 12, 15 years of local experiences, innovating, transgressing, in the field of urban policy against the national legal framework and the dominant interpretation of property rights, right? And they were considered to be unconstitutional. They were dismissed as being illegal. But little by little, they were given not only social political legitimacy, but also legal validity to such an extent that the city statute organizes all these local experiences regarding, for example, the distinction between property rights and building rights and development rights, the idea that you have to charge for development rights, that you have to capture back for the community the surplus value. This is all the result of social political struggles, mostly at the local level, led by social movements in Brazil, right? So this is very much the result of a process. My point was the enactment of the law is not the end of the process. It opens up a new stage, which is that of the disputes for the implementation of the law, the interpretation of the law, the use of the possibilities the law has created.
Move both. Your question is very valid, and I didn't obviously have the time to develop that nuanced nature of law. But if I could just say that the way I interpreted law was not just in the violence of its making, that is the constitution and the property laws that exist, but also it's enforcing in the way that the municipality comes and demolishes the slums. But then also very critically, I think in this context where I was talking about this pathologizing and internalizing is where the judiciary has interpreted law or has made a sudden shift in the interpretation of law. Whereas earlier it used to see the right to life as more important than the right to property, particularly in the case of slums. Now the right to property is seen as more important than the right to life. So in that context, there's a very different kind of discourse that is taking place. So before, if you had politicians giving them patronage and giving them this kind of informal assurances of them being able to continue to live there, that no longer exists. So it is the culture of legality which has evoked these kinds of desires to be part of the legal. And squatters themselves don't see law in any way as something great or valorizing. They're very cynical of it. But they realize that they have to work with it, so they acquire this kind of working knowledge of law in order to take the opportunities that is presented.
Great. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, I'm not so sure. Is that working? Yeah. I don't think that my position is opposed to Iona's. In fact, I was struck by her conclusion about the significance of the demand for the legal city on the part of residents of informal areas, and I would endorse that. That's to what I'm saying. As regards the question of where's the subversion? Well, the point of my last slide about Holston's insurgent citizenship, talking about insurgent home ownership, the subversive bit, if you like, is the demand to have a right to property on the same basis as everybody else in society in a system which has denied people access to housing by other means other than creating both the home and home ownership for themselves. They wanted acknowledging. It's become rather fashionable, I think, to say that, the right to the city doesn't just mean property. But it's very easy for those of us who can assume a right to private property to say that. And I don't think we should dismiss the importance of property to the residents of informal settlements in their understanding of what it means to have a right to the city. But as regards the point about monolithic views, yes, I totally accept that. I'm very well aware that I too have been presenting in a binary format in my desire to counter some of these very negative positions on titling or regularization that are current in the literature. I guess the inescapability of dualisms or binaries is precisely one of my points on this. But to answer you more substantively about where are the more nuanced understandings or more negative understandings, I would point to two things. One is that in the Mexican case, property titling has undoubtedly been used as a means for the political manipulation of the poor through clientelistic systems and electoral practices. Of course, though, if it can be used for that purpose, it's because it matters to the poor and the poor actually do want it. So I would still say that that reinforces my point. But the other thing I would also point to is family law, because one of my concerns about the opposition of titling to community or social embeddedness is that community is always seen as some sort of rather abstract amalgamation of individuals, whereas of course in practice what most people are addressing before community comes family, and many conflicts around property are actually conflicts around family. So if you want to look for nuance or looking for something in the middle, I think we need to look at how legal understanding of property interact with family understandings of property. One specific point where there is in practice a mobility, not as something to be valorized, but as something I've observed empirically, is in terms of what happens when the original owners of property in formalized informal settlements die. Very rarely do they leave, in Mexico, a will, and therefore very rapidly after formalization and titling, areas actually revert to a kind of informality. But it's now an informality that can be seen as a privatized problem, not as a collective one. But that is an example of how things move on that I think hopefully nuances a little the account I've given for the sake of exposition. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will... Nada?
Question to Professor Harvey, and it's particularly about the type of evidence that one provides for, the value of such titling. And I'm all for, I'm an anthropologist, so I take what people say very seriously. However, I do feel that it's important to kind of look at the conditions of life that these kinds of titles actually provide, and in terms of eventually looking at, if they are having to sell them because of other people coming in or not. And that's why I think that in some ways Iona's paper provided, by looking at the kind of the numbers that are given and looking at actually how what's given changes in these resettlements, could actually provide some kind of evidence, to kind of challenge, not to take it as to take what people say at face value, because what legality stands for them comes from the practical conditions in which they live. So,
sure. I was talking about that today, but I've done plenty of research looking in the kind of terms that I think you're asking me about. I started out by trying to test out ideas about titling as necessary for housing improvement. Or, if you like, the De Soto ideas really before De Soto was making a big deal about it, because the ideas were around in Latin America from the 1960s and 1970s onwards. So that's what I was trying to do in the 1980s. What did I find? That people don't want loans. They're very suspicious of formal credit, and that's being confirmed in subsequent studies. That titling is not necessary for housing improvement. But it's not a question. One thing that's very important to say in the Mexican case, possibly elsewhere in Latin America, is as regards the conditions. My position on titling, incidentally, is absolutely not De Soto's. And for anybody who is confused, that's a demonstration of how entrenched our thinking is. If you're not against De Soto, you must be with him. I'm neither. Okay. Titling doesn't make, in Mexico, a great material difference, partly because Services often are installed before properties are titled. Property taxes are charged illegally by the municipality before properties are titled. One of the ways you can demonstrate possession in order to get a title is to produce your property tax receipts. So in fact, there is no sudden massive escalation in the costs of living in an area driving people out. It doesn't happen that way. It takes place little by little over the years. So, the material condition, I think materially, titling doesn't make a huge difference. Right? But the reason that I underline people's positions is because it's been very clear to me from the outset how much people actually want titling. Right? And one other point where it does make a difference is in relation to family disputes. And that is something that in our concern with this crushing weight of state domination, the state or big capital, big businesses, forces of expulsion, we overlook the kind of threats to security of tenure that come from your nearest and dearest, supposedly, and from your neighbours. And that's one area where I think titling is valuable in a, if you like, objective sense.
Hi, my question to Easy Fernandez. So can the 2001 law help to realize reasonable and sustainable implementation, the simultaneous existence of other laws or existing global or national economic or political regimes, i.e. neoliberalism? I mean, because, for example, what you suggested, social mobilization, it seems to me that it's rather reactionary. Like, for example, when you have a problem, then people should mobilize against, or to achieve an implementation. So it's more or less, it's happening like as a process. So.
One last more.
We'll be taking the 2 or 3 questions before you at least present yourself actually before speaking. We'd like to know who you are.
My name is Jeff Rosenthal. I'm a Master of Urban Planning here at AUP. My question is actually open-ended for the panel. I think one thing I was struck by watching these presentations is that it seems the informal sector is very much affected by the same processes as the legal sector. This was obvious looking at Anne Barley's slides where we saw the population shifts, but also looking at Iona Dada's slides, it seems that those who were resettled in earlier years got a much better deal than those that were resettled later. That seems to be very linked to what's happening in most cities where you have an increase of the property market faster than accounts for currency increases. So I'm trying to think through this maybe together. If we understand the informal as being a product from, it's a process. Everyone wants the same things, whether you're living in an informal settlement or not. Everyone wants a property, everyone wants a home. But we're thinking of the informal sector as alternatives, those who are excluded from the legal property market. What can be done more on a system scale than treating the symptoms, I suppose.
Hi, my name is Florence Rochefort. I'm architecture student for here at and my question is for Ms. Ayana. Do you think that resettlement should happen as it's the only way for the right to the city? As I see it, it is a force against the inhabitants and for the benefits of the government. Why resettle when we can enhance the camp and legalize it?
One last question and then we...
Thank you. Fadia Jawara, I'm a postdoc fellow at the Art Institute here in Lebanon. I found Iona's discussion of the internalization and the pathologization of certain discourses by the slum inhabitants really interesting. And I was wondering whether Professor Barley could speak to that, because your reliance on what people were saying, whether, and also your kind of dissection of the critiques against titling seem to be almost suggesting that at the end this is not an empirical issue, this is an issue of ideology, if you like, or a certain type of politics that are espoused in these post-colonial or whatever it is critiques. And I was wondering if you could respond to whether there is a degree of internalization, perhaps, of neoliberal discourse that may have induced the kind of responses that you received.
Maybe a couple more questions. We have some more questions here. Okay.
Mr. Mensch, visiting professor at AUB. Settlements is of course worldwide one of the biggest global questions, as close to 1 million people are living in these kind of settlements, and 1/4 of the global urban population should live in these circumstances. But one thing that is very often overlooked is that these places are gigantic money-making machines. The people there spend more, not only relative to their incomes, but very often in unit cost, absolute cost, they spend more for clean water, energy, security than people in other areas. And if you look at the situation in Latin America or in tropical Africa, very often they are organized in the way that there are national ministers sitting in the national government who actually are the godfathers in last instance of these settlements. So all the way through the political hierarchy, there are people who profit from this kind of living. And that means, of course, that if you start to formalize these informal settlements, somebody loses their regular incomes. And that concerns very influential people, really, political leaders of countries. And I think this is a reason why formalization is difficult in many cases.
First of all, thank you for all your abstracts. They were very interesting. My question is to Madam Data, to Dr. Data. You gave us a good abstract about the slum communities and the settlements in Delhi. We all know that in India we do have the system of castes. So in the religious community, Hinduist community. So my question is the following: is there any relation between this system of caste in India and the slum communities? It means all of them, are they part from the lowest caste, or we can find in the slums a mixture of all the castes? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we will start.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my take on this discussion on informal development, how to tackle it, has become more and more pragmatic. I mean, I think we are discussing here a significant phenomenon affecting 1 billion people or more internationally from the perspective of reform. We are not talking about the revolution here. We are not talking about dispensing with the notions of ownership and all that. So from a perspective of reform, legal reform, political reform, institutional reform, initially you have two sets of questions to consider. First of all is you're going to promote that only through the traditional view of representative democracy, or you're going to widen the scope for participatory, more direct democracy processes to be considered. So this is one discussion. The other discussion is you're going to propose the legal inclusion of this long excluded population by means of imposing a norm for everybody, normalizing all the situations, or your reformed legal system can be more comprehensive so as to accept differences, to accommodate differences, right? I think this is very important, because even when you're discussing differences, you know, again, you have choices to make. You're going to try and come up with a range of rights recognized by the legal system, or you're going to accept that the legal system coexists with another set of regulations, which people call legal pluralism. In my experience, you see, these other forms, which are not part of the legal system itself, they tend to create second-hand rights for second-hand citizens. You know, second-class citizens, second-class rights. So I much prefer the discussion on how to rethink the legal order as a whole so as to accommodate a diverse range of legal rights representing the diversity of situations that we find and which have been historically produced. So the city statute in that respect is very sensitive to that. When it discusses rights to remain on the land, you know, it's not by imposing this normalization or just one legal option. You know, it's by accepting that these areas have been produced differently. And perhaps Brazil's most significant contribution to this debate has been the notion of the special zones of social interest, meaning that those are areas produced differently, they have to be regulated differently, they have to be managed differently, and they entail different forms of titling, not necessarily. So the discussion in Brazil is as much about the people as about the land. Because actually, if you ask people these days in most shanty towns in Brazil, if they want titles, they say, no, we don't. We are happy, you know, living in this ambiguous gray zone here, having urban freedoms and not paying tax. It depends on where you are, right? But from the viewpoint of the land, from the viewpoint of the city, there is a need to do something. Not doing anything is no longer a policy option in Brazil because of the numbers involved, because of the social, environmental, financial implications. So we don't view informality merely as a solution, as a lot of people still do. We see that also as a problem. You know, so the matter here is how to answer to recognizing people's rights. So the matter of mobility, for example, how to recognize mobility, but at the same time preventing eviction by the market. So what has been attempted in Brazil so far is not so much tying people to the land, but tying the land to a social function, especially when the land is public, especially when the land is communal. Right? When you're occupying private land, there's another legal logic to be observed. But most people are not. They're occupying public land or communal land. So the logic there is not one of property rights. It's a matter of housing rights. Property rights may be one way of materializing housing rights, but it's not the only one, and oftentimes it's not the best one. So, you know, and again, it cannot be reduced to individual rights. You can discuss community land trusts, you can discuss collective rights, you can discuss all sorts of other possible arrangements so that, you know, you promote integration as well as recognizing people's individual security of tenure. And I'm all in favor of legalization, titling, formalization. But the question is how to promote that so as to find this balance between what people say they need, what people believe they need. Now people who are being evicted now as a result of large-scale projects in Brazil, they are understanding that exactly because they refused titles, they didn't claim for titles. Now they are being paid compensation only for the constructions, not for the land. You see what I mean? So there's this need to understand that it is as much about the people as it is about the city, as it is about the land itself.
Thank you.
I'll be short. It's not working, is it?
Is this working?
Yeah. Okay, quite a few diverse range of questions. First of all, whether resettlement should happen. Well, there's been a long debate in India, I think across the global south, that resettlement away from where slums settled is wrong because it takes them away from their livelihoods and everything else. So the squatters don't think that they want resettlement. They don't want resettlement. It's only in that condition where resettlement is the only option that they argue for resettlement. For the state, resettlement is very expensive. And the way that they have enacted it is actually in a very tokenistic fashion in just allocating plots, still keeping control in more recent years by giving license rather than freehold, and then not providing any basic infrastructure. So actually they have provided worse conditions than slums than these people who are evicted are coming from. So in that sense, from a moral, ethical point of view, yes, no, it should not happen. But in the context that we are in a way that the judiciary works now, in a very punitive way, in a very, very neoliberal understanding or interpretation of law, I think that's becoming more and more the only option. But, and this goes to the question about capital. Capital is very important, and that shapes the unevenness of the evictions and the resettlement. So if you remember that map I showed you, there are only certain parts of Delhi that are allocated for resettlement sites. There are other parts of, on the peripheries of Delhi, other satellite cities like Gurgaon, Noida, for example, which are very middle class, upper class, with multinational corporations coming in. So there's a big uneven spatialization of the satellite and the urban peripheries where the slum dwellers are going to and where global capital is coming in. And that's differentiated. So for the state, it makes sense, but they're not going to be able to invest it. And a lot of these infrastructure has been provided by subcontracting, and which makes the slum dwellers pay much more now than they used to before. So it's a very complex thing, and we can have a discussion later on, but thanks for raising that. Now the question about caste, I could talk another hour, and I didn't go into that here because there's a very complex relationship between caste, religion, gender, ethnicity, rural-urban identity, all of that which plays in very interesting ways in different spaces and at different times in the slums. In particular, in general, a large number of population is low caste, Muslims, some Dalit, low caste Christians as well. But in India, and particularly in this particular slum, I think I can safely say that in most of the slums, caste system exists not just amongst Hindus, it exists amongst Muslims and Christians as well, and that might be quite shocking. But it refers back, and the way that the discrimination happens within the community, and this goes back again to Anne's comment about the community is not a monolith. There's a lot of intimate control exerted by the community within the slum in the ways that access to power is negotiated in this context of legality, and who is able to make use of the law in order to gain control and power and ultimately gain access to the legal city is negotiated through these power politics between caste, religion, ethnicity, rural-urban identity, and so on. So within even the Muslims or the Christians in the slum, there is a lot of differentiation about who is lower caste and who is upper caste, which goes back to historical processes of conversion and so on. And they talk about often some of the exclusionary elements that they face through law is blamed on some of the lower castes within the slum itself. So there is a differentiation within that as well. And I can't really go into too much detail now because we don't have the time, but it's a minefield. We can talk about it later.
Thank you.
Cheers. Okay. Briefly, the question about treating the symptoms or the looking for systematic cures, I'm unapologetically focused on the symptomatic. Right? As regards the question of evidence, I'm very surprised that you think I was trying to, as it were, speak against the evidence because you weren't too happy about what I was saying. My whole point is precisely that many of these critics do not look at the evidence. For example, in relation to taxes, which can explain very easily and effectively why people in Mexico welcome titling, whereas maybe people in some favelas in Brazil don't do so. But in relation to your interesting question about to what extent is it possible that people are internalizing neoliberal discourse? No, I don't think that's the case. In many years of looking at how people talk about housing and the process of housing themselves or renting, I'd say there's two main components. One is a historical one to their discourse, which is based on the nature of colonialism in Latin America and the importance of private property in that. So private property is extraordinarily important to people. People describe their homes, to quote from one person who spoke to me, as modern houses in marginalized areas, not marginal, but marginalized. In other words, very aware of their own status, but claiming to aspirations of modernity. But the anthropologist Claudio Lomnitz has a very interesting set of ideas about what modernity means in Mexico, and talks to one kind of discourse around modernity, which is, he identifies as a nationalistic one, which is very much about making do, putting things together as best you can, and that to me seems to describe informality very well. Whereas, and the other discourse, I should say, is a very strongly Catholic one. It's all about the value of suffering that you suffer in order to achieve something. In this particular case, having somewhere for your children to live, and the discourse of suffering is extremely important in that context. So no, it's not a neoliberal discourse or an internalization of that. However, your question is extremely interesting, because where I think there is an internalization of neoliberal discourse, and where the kinds of critiques of Payne et al. About home ownership not necessarily being for everyone, where that becomes extremely relevant, is what's happened in Mexico and other parts of Latin America in the last decade or so, where there has been a massive expansion of formal, serviced housing for the poor, but for the salaried poor, so not the poorest poor, but at great distance, sometimes 20 or 30 kilometers from the built-up area, with servicing, but in extremely poor conditions, poor sites. So, for example, in some cases, these houses are falling down virtually before they've been put up. The residents have a guarantee for 10 years, but what's going to happen to them after that? In sites which flood, extremely small in Mexican terms, nothing like the kinds of terms that Iona was talking about, extremely small plots. And talking with people in those areas, I've come across a level of anxiety and anger that I've never come across in all the years I've worked in informal settlements. And I think that is partly about taking on the assumption that in a modern, globalized Mexico, we expect to have access to ready-built housing that we buy on credit, just as we buy all sorts of other things on credit, including the scaled-down furniture that will actually fit into these houses. And one thing that for personal reasons, I wasn't able to go to Mexico for most of a decade, and one thing that really hit me when I got back is the rise of the number of, sorry, the word's escaping me, where you take, if you need money, it's not loans, but you take some pawn shops. There, in one street, in an area that I'm very familiar with for a long time, I saw 3 different pawn shops within 200 or 300 yards. So I think where the neoliberal discourse has become important in Mexico is that we are entitled to the ready-made, not to have to scrimp and put things together as our parents did. And that is causing a great deal of distress. And I would like to hear some of the critics of titling and informality take on what's happening at the moment.
Thank you very much. We will end this panel here. So the next panel is at 3, representing property. And thank you for attending.